Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday evening space show program, and I'm your host, David Livingston. Thank you very much for tuning in. Before I introduce our guest, who has been with us from time to time, almost since the beginning of the space show, going back 25 years. I think I met him first at a small sat conference in Utah. Couple of real quick announcements. On Wednesday, which is tomorrow, Doug Messier is planning to break down for John Batchelor the new NASA, how we're going to the moon program, how we're going to put nuclear power on Mars, and whatever else they think they're going to do. So that's John Batchelor's Hotel Mars program. Friday is David Eicher. He's the former editor of Astronomy magazine, and he wants to come on and talk about the space show. And I've been a reader of astronomy since I was in high school, so we're going back into the early 60s, maybe the late 50s, sky and telescope and astronomy. So be anxious to talk to him. And there is no program on Easter Sunday. And then Bob Zubrin is Tuesday night, April 7th. And he's going to talk about going to Venus. No eyes rise on going to Venus. So for those of you in the audience, he will be talking about going to Mars. Jason Andrews is with us, and Jason has led a voyage through space and commercial space and development in the launch industry, and now to people flying in space that spans easily more than 2 decades, right? I'm sure of that.
Uh, Actually, three now. I started at Kistler Aerospace in 1995.
So, so he really knows the industry, what works, what doesn't work, what has the potential. He knows bullshit, I think, from the real stuff. And we're really fortunate to have him. He has founded, or co-founded a new program, which is called Orbite Space. And I will let him tell you about that. But I think you should all find out about it, or Bite Space, I guess is a better way to pronounce it.
Orbite. It's a French pronunciation, yes. But
Okay,
I'll give the background.
okay, and uh, Spaceflight Industries, Black Sky, quite a few different businesses. So welcome back, Jason. How are you? And
It's wonderful to be here, David, as always.
talk
Yes.
talk about your voyage of all of the commercial space and the projects in the launch industry when there was no commercial launch industry, when there was no service industry, to where you are now and where you think it might be going.
No, it has been a journey, and I've been lucky to be in some cases at the right place at the right time. I graduated from the University of Washington up in the Seattle area, and when I was there, there was a local company looking to hire people right out of school called Kistler Aerospace Corporation. And the way I describe Kistler Aerospace, looking back with a lens of history, was Kistler Aerospace was SpaceX before there was SpaceX, and it was back when we were going to darken the skies with internet satellites the first time,
Good.
which was in 1995, the birth of the internet. It was undecided if we were going to build out the internet through terrestrial networks or through space networks, and there was a bunch of space entrepreneurs, Craig McCaw and Bill Gates probably being the leading ones, that started a range of companies, most of which you've never heard of. There was Teledesic was the leading company, and that was Kistler's main focus, co-founded there in Kirkland, Washington, a suburb of Seattle, back in the early 90s. But there was other companies, some of which survived, like Iridium and Global Star, about how to build out telephony through space. And there was other companies like Starbridge and others that I can't even remember the names of. Unfortunately, we didn't have low cost satellites, and so the economics did not pencil out, and ultimately all of those companies went bankrupt in the 19 late 1990s, 1998, 1999 timeframe. And at the time there was a host of launch companies that were there to launch these satellites to space, of which Kistler was, I would say, the leading company at the time. They raised $400 million of private equity, which was real back in 1995. It's probably over $1 billion today to build a two-stage fully reusable launch vehicle, which is what Elon Musk and SpaceX is tackling, as along with other companies like Stoke Space. But this is 30 years ago, and maybe it was all just a little bit too early for the technology. So after I was lucky to have a lot of responsibility early on, helping design the rocket, running various subsystems and elements of the company, which set me up so that when Kistler ultimately fell upon hard times along with that whole sector, I left and started consulting and ultimately was able to start my first company, Andrew Space, with the help of my wife, Mary and Joe. And so we built this company for a decade doing project-based business for the government. Um, uh, Dr. Kathari and I met on multiple programs because we did hypersonics for DARPA. We did early days of cargo logistics to the International Space Station before you had the commercial crew and cargo programs. We worked on small satellite missions. But ultimately, in 2008, we pivoted to this emerging technology called nanosats and CubeSats, and we're one of the first companies to identify commercial use cases for these. And so from 2008 to 2010, we had a contract with the United States Army, and this is just after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Um, and what we did is they asked, can we put UAVs in space? UAVs were cheap to build, but very expensive to operate, and they had limited operating range. And they said, well, can you put these build a low cost spacecraft that can provide real time Earth imaging? And can you put it into space? And we explained to the Army that there was probably a couple miracles required to make that happen. Because at the time it was $100 million to build a satellite and $100 million to launch the same satellite, and they wanted to build and launch it for $2 million. So Andrew Space set about trying to build that satellite and had to build all the components to make it happen. It took quite a while. At the same time, there was no way to launch it. And so I looked at how to launch this constellation of low cost, small nanosatellites using a rideshare approach, which ultimately led to the second company called Spaceflight. And we helped ultimately came up with a business model for doing that by publishing a website that had pricing, had flight opportunities, it had classes of service. And I think that was one of the critical elements in enabling the small sat revolution. Our first clients were Planet. The Planet founders came and wrote a personal check to get that company launched. They were our first customer, and we launched their first satellites, and I guess the rest is history. But we went on to launch everybody else's satellites along the way, companies that you hear about today, some of which have gone public or are going public. But we had a front row seat to launching everybody's satellites in the, call it 2010 to 2013 timeframe. And so I realized that the Army was never going to build this constellation of real-time Earth imagery satellites. So I ended up starting a third company called Black Sky, which was there to commercialize that infrastructure and sell it as a service. And was fortunate that came to pass. We raised a lot of money to do it. It was a very difficult journey. Ultimately, Black Sky has been successful. It's gone public. It's delivering critical real-time Earth imaging right now across the globe and in the conflict in the Middle East. But in 2018, I took a break and said, what's next? And to me, what was next is, given the small satellite revolution was in full swing, it also, Elon Musk at that point had announced Starship for SpaceX. At the same time, the various suborbital players like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin were very advanced in developing their systems. And it felt like now is the moment that commercial human spaceflight was about to literally and figuratively take off. And as we looked across the industry, there was a lot of people building infrastructure and space transportation systems, but there was no one to train on prepare all these passengers to go to space. And historically, NASA and other governments train government employees to go to space, but they don't train private citizens. So along the way, I met my business partner and co-founder, Nicholas Gohm. And in 2019, we created Orbite, which is orbit in French. And because like aviation 100 years ago, the early people going to space were wealthy individuals because it was a very expensive proposition. It was pioneering a new technology, new trade routes, and that's exactly what's going to happen in commercial human spaceflight. And so Orbite is a bit of a luxury brand, and if you're going to have a luxury brand, you need a French name. So I'll pause there. That's my background and also the founding story of Orbite.
Um, I was writing my business school dissertation in the mid 90s, and I had all of those companies that you mentioned, plus the single stage to orbit rocket companies for space tourism. And I had two advisors that kicked my ass, and one was from Boeing, and the other one was from Stanford. And they said, "You have to rework your numbers because this stuff isn't going to work." And so it did publish in January and February or February of 2001, and they were all gone by roughly that time. And also the undersea fiber networks that were self-correcting were kicking the ass of GEO back then with their self-repairs and their cost. And again, launch costs were pretty high. So I had to do a lot of reworking to be current. And now all of that's 180 degrees from what I wrote and published in 2001. So it's interesting to look back and see how everything materialized and then changed and then evolved. And you can't help but wonder where we're going to be 5 years or 10 years out or 15 years out from now. But, Jason, I've done many shows with people who said they're starting schools to service the commercial spaceflight wannabe passenger.
Mhm.
From Florida to Pennsylvania to Astronauts for Hire, which you probably remember, and all sorts of ventures. And I don't think any of them really made any progress. I don't know if any of them still exist or not. So for Orbit, you have to have a different business model for sure, and a different idea of what your market is from what I used to hear these people talk about. So tell us what it is. What is your unique view? What is your model? Who's your customer? How are you doing this when others before you, 5, 6, 10 years earlier, couldn't do it? I can assume the market wasn't there then, but I've looked at your website, so you're not doing the same thing that these guys said they were doing with their, we're going to teach you how to fly in space schools.
Yeah, no, that you're asking the critical question is what's different, what's changed, and I think that's a really important discussion topic. Let me see if I can unpack that. I mean, first, I've had a lot of good. I wouldn't be successful if I didn't have good mentors, and one of my mentors pointed out in investing, being early is the same thing as being wrong. And so I think timing is really important. And I would say that up until 2020, you were too early. And in hindsight, when we started this company in 2019, 2020 timeframe, we were even too early because we started the company not because of Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic or the Dragon capsule. We started the business because of Starship, because Starship was going to fundamentally lower the cost of access to space and increase the frequency of access to space to the point that humanity can economically step into low Earth orbit. And Elon believes we can go all the way to Mars. And I've learned never to doubt Elon Musk. So it's a bit of the timing associated with the cost of access to space. So we believe, and I'll give a story. When I started Spaceflight, the company, we published our pricing. And so we were that go-between between the launch providers and the satellite operators. And we understood where the market tipped, like where the satellite operators could really afford to launch. And we'll use an ESPA class spacecraft. If anyone can remember back to 2010, the cost of an ESPA class spacecraft back then was $10 to $20 million. And what we heard from the clients was it needed to be $5 million. And I remember seeing with George Whitesides, who's the CEO of Virgin Galactic, when they were working on Launcher One, and my company Spaceflight was one of their launch customers. And I sat in George's office and I said, George, the market clearing price for an ESPA class spacecraft is $5 million. So Launcher One needs to cost $5 million, and you have a business. or it's not going to happen. And I think that proved to be true because even today it's less than $5 million. If you look at the most recent transporter flight earlier this week, that's effectively what that cost is, and what makes the economics work in the small satellite revolution. And later on with spaceflight, we had so much demand, and it goes actually back to India. Initially, we were launching most of our rockets on Russian rockets, but then Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, and we lost access to Russian rockets. And we didn't have a lot of other options at the time. And it was only later that we were able to open up India and do some early PSLV launches. But in that interim phase, we had so much demand and nowhere to fly. So we bought a Falcon 9 in 2015, which ultimately flew in 2018 as our SSOA launch, where it was a pioneering launch, the first time 63 satellites flew on an existing mission. But what we learned from that was ultimately told Gwen Shotwell, it's like, hey, we're launching satellites today, but when you want to start flying people, we want to launch people tomorrow. But it's understanding that middle space and what makes the market happen. So for us, the market clearing price for a ticket to orbit, not suborbital, but to orbit is about $10 million. At that point, I think you hit an inflection point where it lowers the cost, whether you're a small country with a space program, so a B2G client, a business looking to do manufacturing in space, or a consumer looking to go to space. I think we're at a point where there's a macro evolution that is driving this change. At the same time, from a business model standpoint, like I said, we're just doing space flight, but for humans. And from that perspective, we're focused on a handful of high net worth individuals that want to train and prepare and ultimately go to space. But at the same time, if you go to our website today, you see experience, train, fly, because we only have a handful of clients that will fly to space in the next decade. At the same time, as prices continue to go down and Starship has the ability to drive those economics and that price point down, there's lots of people that hope to go to space in their lifetime. So they're willing to come and train, knowing that someday in their lifetime they could go and fly to space. At the same time, we spent a lot of time with people, high net worth individuals. And while everyone on this program is very knowledgeable about space and passionate about space, the general public knows very little about space. Uh, as an example, the public discourse about Artemis 2, the fact that we're about to fly humans around the moon for the first time in over 50 years is just, it's not there. And so our whole goal has been to raise the visibility and in some cases engage people who could be astronaut candidates in something they recognize, which looks more like space edutainment or a holiday that they would already pay for. And so that's what our experience programs are. So I would say what's different is one, macro, the technology is reaching a point where we can deliver an experience at a enabling price point. And two, our go-to-market is about building the pipeline of clients to go to space. And ultimately, most of our revenue will be generated here on Earth, preparing people or giving people the experience of astronaut training while the industry matures to a point where they can engage at some point in their lifetime.
Two quick questions. Are you training for suborbital, LEO, a planetary surface, or maybe an orbital station, O'Neill type of vehicle? And do you need a destination for these people to get hooked on? And if you do, what is the destination when they launch?
So what we do is our training, our astronaut training curriculum. So I will go through, maybe I'll walk through our experience, train, fly, and paint the whole picture of what we offer. So let's start with the fly. We offer the ability to people to fly on whatever mission they want to do. We work to engage cohorts, prepare them, and if they want to fly on a suborbital, we consult with them and push them towards Blue or Virgin. If they want to fly on orbital, we push them towards effectively SpaceX because they're the only game in town, whether it's Dragon or Starship. I would say the most interest is in Starship. And we're actively having discussions on how to put people on these very first flights, which I think could happen by the end of this decade. At the same time, to prepare those people, the training program is tied to your mission and your destination. So we have developed a training curriculum that's kind of like your college level courses, where you have your 100 level courses, your 200 level courses, your 300 and 400 level courses. And our entry level 100 level course is something we call astronaut orientation, where we bring in potential clients educate them on spaceflight and what the different mission options are. For example, most people don't know the difference between suborbital and orbital flight. And even if they knew suborbital flight, they don't really know the difference between what is a Blue experience or a Virgin Galactic experience or a Dragon experience or a destination experience. And so we not only educate them, but we simulate it through virtual reality. And then we expose them to zero G through a zero G flight and high G through a high G flight so that they come away kind of going zero to hero in their basic knowledge of what my options are. And then from there, you could step into suborbital training where it's really focused on the physical, mental, and spiritual training required to maximize your space flight. You don't need to do this training to book a blue flight and go on a blue mission. Um, you'll survive it just fine. But for what you're spending and for the time allotted, it's important to maximize your benefit from that. And then we have an orbital training program, which is really focused on the mission specifics, whether it's destination or a free flyer, or is it a capsule or a Starship? And then ultimately, as the industry matures, sure, would we want to prepare people to go to the moon or anywhere else? Absolutely. But right now, it's very much the early days. And then finally, our experience programs takes elements of astronaut training. You know, you don't get the certification of astronaut training. It's a fun experience where it's really an educational experience. For example, I just flew in from Curacao, where we're partnering with a company called U-Boat Works, which is a private submarine company, where we're using the underwater environment to simulate the operations of a spacecraft. It's the closest analogy we've identified on Earth to simulate both the remoteness and the subsystems that you might see in a Dragon capsule. So you go down there to experience that elements of it and the subsystems around that. So that's an example of what we do on space experiences. It ranges from the luxurious and educational to interest.
Are you talking to any of the private space station companies about flying people on their space stations, assuming that they get built and operational?
It's safe to say we're talking to everybody. If you are building infrastructure and that's a launch vehicle, a destination, or going all the way to the moon, we're working with all of those companies without being specific. We put some announcements on our website, but I can't disclose more than what's on our website. But ultimately, yes, we are about sending people to space. And again, where we believe the industry is going, and then you asked why is it different, is we believe space transportation is going to evolve like any other transportation industry, whether it was aircraft or rail or sea, where ultimately this new technology was developed by some innovative entrepreneurs and they realized and perfected that technology. But at the end of the day, it was a service business that came in and was client facing and built the service business on top of the infrastructure. And the biggest example is aircraft. You have Boeing, you have Airbus, and then you have hundreds of airlines. So we think space is going to evolve the same way. You will have people that build and operate the rockets, but companies like Orbite being one of the first, but others will come and build a service business on top of that. And maybe actually the current leaders, Axiom, if you look at what they're doing, while they are a space infrastructure company, they had to build a service business somewhat out of necessity early on. And they provide services to the ISS using SpaceX and NASA infrastructure.
Um, there are a couple of companies that are claiming that they're almost ready to go, and I'm not buying it. I'm just telling you what their PR claims. Operational in a very short period of time with a space hotel. So I'm sure you've come across this, and of course I'm totally skeptical, but that would be one hell of a destination. So do you guys train for a commercial hotel? I mean, that's different, like than maybe going on a space station or another type of destination. Are you thinking that that seriously is going to be an opportunity maybe by the end of the decade? I don't think it's going to be in a year or two. But what are your
I
thoughts
think
on that?
I think space hotels are very viable at a specific price point. And I'll go back to my $10 million market clearing price. If you and let's just talk about the current state of the art, which is Dragon, which is a phenomenal system. But um, current pricing is out there sort of in the 55 to $65 million range, maybe as high as $75 million range. depending on if you want to go on a free flyer or to the ISS or to VAST. It's in that range. I don't want to be specific, but the reality is the mostly the only people that have been able to sign up is sovereign astronauts. And if you go and look at the NASA ignition announcement last week, they acknowledged that hey, the commercial demand for private citizens to pay $55 million is pretty small, and we've seen that directly. I do think it changes considerably when you get to 20 million and less, with 10 million being the market clearing price. So if we had a way to get to a hotel, stay on the hotel, and come back at 10 to 15 million dollars for an all-inclusive experience, I think there absolutely would be demand.
Fascinating. How do you simulate uh, microgravity or no gravity in your training?
So we're really not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're taking 60 years of pioneering work done by NASA and other space agencies and adapting it for commercial clientele and also condensing it. As you know, NASA astronauts, once they're admitted to the program, spend the first 2 years training. Well, most private citizens don't have 2 years to take off and go train. So how do you do it in 6 weeks? So we have like a Cliff Notes version of how to simulate the different elements to get them space grade ready. And that's for their safety. It's for the safety of the crew and the safety of the mission. So to answer your question specifically about microgravity, we use the same techniques NASA does. We use zero-G aircraft and neutral buoyancy facilities or pools, or just diving in the underwater environment. It's the only good analogies we have here, analogs here on Earth for simulating that.
Marshall, you have a question or comment?
Yes. As I recall, the latest Falcon 9, I think it's booster 1032, has something like 33 missions. Do you see that Starship will get anywhere close to that? Are they going to be able to go to 40? And then we have all the fun economics of amortization of the launch costs and the vehicle costs. And where do you think the cost of uh, a kilogram to orbit is going to end up?
That's a fantastic question. You're absolutely right. I think I even saw something on X today saying they might have one that goes to 38, but it's in the same ballpark. I totally agree with you. It's in the mid 30s somewhere. I think Starship, I think Falcon 9 was designed with reusability in mind, but they were hopeful that it would be as reusable as it's proven out to be. I don't think anyone really knows, and that's why they're doing fundamental industry pathfinder work to show the reusability. Whereas Starship was designed from the get-go to be highly reusable. And I don't want to quote, what factors SpaceX is proposing, but I'm guessing it's at least 100 flights. At the same time, if you look at the rate that they're producing boosters, I don't know what the cost of these spaceships are, but it's probably comparable to a mid-sized Boeing or Airbus aircraft that's in the 150 to 300 million range. It could be a small fraction of that. But
Yeah.
to your point, I think we're getting to a point where the amortization of the vehicle is measured in single digit millions per flight, and their real cost comes down to propellant. And if you look at what they're putting in their environmental impact statements, and most recently what they're doing at Starbase, they're building a propellant manufacturing facility where
Mhm.
there's not enough methane and liquid oxygen on the planet or infrastructure to generate that, from Air Liquide to supply SpaceX. So as a result, they're having to generate their own propellant. And when you do that, you get down to basic feedstock and the cost of power. And Elon does know something about, powering data centers and other things. So I actually think the cost of access to space will come down mostly to the cost of power, not even the cost of propellant. Uh,
Mhm.
and so let's just do some math. He's talking about going from 100 metric tons to 200 metric tons. And let's say he can launch that for $5 million, or to make the math simple, $10 million. And I think it could be an order of magnitude less. The cost per kilogram to space is measured in dollars. And that's why I think when we talk about $10 million per seat, the reality is on a cost basis, he could get down to hundreds of thousands of dollars a seat to go to space. It's just
Mhm.
until there's competition, there's no reason to drive the cost down. The cost of space launch has gone up from SpaceX in the last couple of years because there is no competition. So the best thing for the industry is that somebody comes along and provides some real competition, because that will introduce market economics.
Mhm. I agree. Bless uh, Rocket Lab, and keep going, because he's going to get
Exactly.
Elon to drop his price. But then back to the cost of getting into space. Uh, I could probably talk the wife into letting me go to space. We got it down to like $100 a pound. And okay, yeah, okay. We're talking about 100,000, 150,000. I I could squeeze my kids for that much. But then you have the problem of, will I be healthy enough? So what's the criteria for minimum health?
That's a great question, because that's the discussion we're having at Orbit right now. Because let's put this in perspective. First of all, we've had our first medical event on the ISS recently that required an emergency evacuation.
Mhm.
But that just shows that health is a critical part of understanding and sending people to space. Now, let's also look at the history of spaceflight. We've had less than 700 people over what, 60 years go to
Yep.
space. And what I believe is, when you get down under $10 million a ticket, you could have 1,000 people go to space in a year. And I know that sounds fanciful. And David, it goes a little bit back to your question about space hotels. But let's say, um, if there's 20 people can fly on a Starship at $10 million a ticket, and they flew once a week, just once a week, that's 1,000 people in a year. And so now we're to a point where, if Orbit is building our programs, one of our big focus areas is space health, and establishing what is our health program. Because if 700 people in the history of humanity over 60 years have flown to space, and we're talking about flying 1,000 people a year in the near future, now suddenly we're responsible for the exact question you just talked about, Marshall, is screening everybody, predicting issues and health projections. And I believe, and this has already been discussed, our position, Orbit's position, not SpaceX's position, but Orbit's position on these first Starship missions, is there'll be nominally 12 passengers, and there'll be 3 crew members. And one of those crew members will be a doctor, so that it's no longer the paradigm where you send 4 people and they have to cook their own food and clean up after themselves. It will be more like a current luxury yacht experience, where there's crew that prepares your food and takes care of you and whatnot.
Ooh.
So
Yeah.
we're right in the middle of defining what should those health standards be as a function of the mission duration. Meaning, if you're going on a 10-minute suborbital flight, that's one thing. If you're going on a 5-day low Earth orbit cruise ship, I'll use that terminology, that's another answer. But if you're going beyond low Earth orbit around the moon, where you're stuck there for a period of days, that's going to be a whole nother level of health and preparation.
uh, Thank you very much. Let's let somebody else talk.
Are you factoring in what the regulatory world might be like in the future? I don't know if there's any way to accurately guess that, but not just the United States regulatory regime, but maybe international, European, others. Does that factor into any of your business thinking or market thinking?
It's a good question. I mean, right now we have the Wild West, where
Huh.
out of necessity, the industry lobbied the FAA to have a moratorium on safety standards until they proved out their systems. And that moratorium has been extended. At some point, that moratorium will expire. And what happens next? And all I can say is speak for us and how we think about this problem. Well, we think, look, you can go look at his analogies. You can look at aviation, where the federal government through the FAA legislates, pilot qualifications, crew qualifications, health and safety. At the same time, you can look at the dive industry, where an industry association, PADI, and there's others, came up with a standard to standardize across multiple operators, both domestically and internationally. I'm we're hopeful to establish a patty type model and are actively reaching out to industry players who are currently involved to say, hey, can we establish some standards? And I think those two standards, the first standard is the health standards. Can we agree on what is the common health criteria everyone needs to meet to go to space? Because that's not, other than doing a safety briefing, there's nothing much beyond that legislated from the FAA. And then second is, can we also establish a common set of training standards? Because in this world where there are infrastructure operators and service providers, there's going to be, and this goes back to your intro, David, there's going to be multiple people that come along and say, I'm doing astronaut training. Well, there's no standard right now on what is astronaut training. And it's incumbent upon the industry to establish standards so that if you go to operator A or operator B, that training is somewhat acceptable, and that when Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic or SpaceX or brand X, Y, and Z comes along and says, well, I did my orbital training at Orbite, I know what I get. And I want to make one final point is, just like if you're a pilot, there's different levels of training. You get your uh, visual flight rules, and you get your instrument flight rules, and you get your commercial, and you get your multi-engine. That just makes you qualified as a pilot, but then you have to get type certified on an aircraft. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here in space is you will get qualified to go to space, but you're not type certified for your mission. And there will be missions, vehicle specific training. For example, if you're going to fly on Starship, you need to get trained on Starship systems. If you're going to go fly on Dragon, you're going to get trained on Dragon systems. And those are two different missions and two different sets of rules and infrastructure. So that's how we see the industry evolving and are actively working to try to establish some of those standards. And it's going to take years. It's not going to be overnight.
So I've to me, it's a fun question, but might be insulting to a few. Others might think it's stupid. But you've never flown on a plane until you have a morbidly obese person who's hanging halfway into your chair. So the airlines have tried to charge extra and make the person buy a second ticket. They also said something about weight and balance, depending on what kind of airplane it is. And I don't know if anybody morbidly obese would want to fly to space or have a doctor that might tell them they're fit to do that. But morbidly obese those pounds would probably factor in on a launch. Is that a criteria that anybody looks at, is the weight of a passenger, or maybe even the size of a passenger, other than height? Because I know height is an issue for, say, fighter pilots and things like that. But
Well, our overall approach is to allow everyone to go to space and inform them of their risk, and to, if it's going to endanger them or their fellow crewmates or the mission, then it is our job to not allow them to go, because that would be terrible if someone died in space. So ultimately, that's going to be the decision of the operators, and it'll be a joint between who's ever flying the infrastructure as well as the service provider. But I will say we have that right now in our training. We do zero G training and high G training, and there are height and weight restrictions, especially for high G training. So part of this will be self-select out. At the same time, because there are no doctors in space currently, and there are no hospitals in space currently, we have a whole space health lifestyle program that we try to do to prepare people and get them to a level of fitness that we would recommend for them to go to space. So there are programs for everybody to get from here to there.
Will there be a comprehensive physical as part of being certified or whatever?
You should see my chats with my team on we're working through that right now. We're looking at NASA standards. We're looking at NSF standards for what testing people do before they go to Antarctic for the winter, because there's limited medical infrastructure there. So you have to, yes, do a battery of tests that provide insight and we were and that is part of our training programs. So there will be certain tests and physicals and everything you need to do if you want to go down the journey of doing astronaut training and ultimately fly to space. And there will be a level of health monitoring prior to the mission that will establish hysteresis, at least 6 months of, tracking blood pressures and all the critical things you would think. I have the NASA certification document. It's 108-page long, and we're trying to start there and start crossing off things to say, how do we make it simpler for a shorter duration mission?
Hey, Jen, you
Mhm.
want to enter the
Yeah,
conversation?
yeah. Jason, have you been contacting or contacted by nations to do this? For example, I mean, India is going to do this Gaganyaan program, I guess, starting from next year or something like that, where they'll probably have to send several astronauts. One of them, of course, went to ISS, 6 months ago or something. But they will need experience and they'll need training. So have you been contacted by nations, specifically in this case, obviously India, but you don't have to, so specific. But have you been talking to nations to have this kind of a thing? So can you do that, or would that be useful?
The short answer is yes. As I alluded to earlier, the early adopters of the Dragon missions have been countries with sovereign astronauts, but at the same time, some of them have limited infrastructure to do astronaut training and instruction. And so we have worked in partnership with other providers as well as worked directly with nations to have those conversations. Obviously,
Mhm.
there's tier one countries that have existing space programs, and I would actually put India in that because they've been working on it for quite some time
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
want their own infrastructure, in which case working with Orbite doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're a smaller country or newer emerging
Mhm.
space
Mhm.
country, yes, we've had conversations and we'd love to work with them.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, at the same time, I mean, India spent $55 million to send Sharma to ISS and all that. And even though they may have some of these facilities, but some of these things probably don't come to them easily enough. So I would think that they may still be interested if there is, reasonably priced thing for,
Mhm.
from Orbit.
We would be very interesting. Look, we're an international organization. Our center of gravity in the United States is Cape Canaveral, Florida. At the same time, we also have announced that we've opened a European subsidiary, and I've spent expensive time in the Middle East, and we're working on
Mm-hmm.
an analog facility there for Moon and Mars exploration. So we would absolutely love the connection. So I'd love to follow up.
Yeah, UAE would, come to mind, for example.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Marshall?
Um, my question is, all the early test pilots, Mercury, Apollo, so on, came from test pilots, and all of them were previously fighter pilots. And quote unquote, if you didn't fit into the airplane, you didn't get to go. And that brings up the question, well, what's the limits on our current Dragon capsule? How big a people can you handle? And, how big a person can go through the portholes, et cetera, et cetera. Which leads to the question, what does SpaceX plan to do with Starship as far as, physical restrictions on the people in the seats and so on like that? Because, you know, uh, once you're in the Starship, you're part of the hardware.
Exactly right. I'll be honest, I don't think that's defined enough, and we'll work with SpaceX to roll that out. So I mean, SpaceX was as exciting as this near future is. Um, the announcements over the last 3 months, as SpaceX works on focusing on going public, probably pushed the first crew flight out, unfortunately, versus bringing it in.
Mm-hmm.
They're very focused on crew to the moon first. Obviously, Elon has announced the integration of XAI and orbital data
Mm-hmm.
centers. which is just going to expand the manifest requirements of Starship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a good thing in that, SpaceX established the safety of Falcon 9 by launching a lot of commercial satellites as well as Starlink missions. And they're going to do the exact same thing with Starship. They're going to fly hundreds of times out of necessity to launch next generation Starlink, next generation, whatever the orbital data center is called, which will build the reliability and the confidence in the system so that when humans come online, everyone knows that that's a safe vehicle.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully the standards are a little better than the banana.
We've
Hopefully.
we've we've talked a lot on the show about the orbital data centers and lunar mass drivers and the economics of it. It seems to be somewhat controversial. There's not universal agreement that the economics are there or that it's cheaper to do it in space than it is to do it on Earth. Pick your brain. What do you think about it when you see these plans? And do you think that's the economic way to go for data centers over Earth? They always hold up what it's costing to do this power plant for data centers in Louisiana, which is pretty astronomical. So,
Well, let me answer at a macro level and then a SpaceX specific level. What I learned at Black Sky was that the small satellite revolution was about building an industrial process, because the reason it didn't work the first time with teledesic was that the state of the art then was you built a satellite, it had to live for 7 years or 8 years or 10 years. It was the geo model, and you had to amortize the cost and the development cost over that period of time. And the problem is that model is incompatible with Moore's law, which, as everyone knows, is where technology advances by orders of magnitude faster. And you could say it's 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. In the world of AI, it feels like it's weeks instead of months. But what the small satellite revolution was about was about breaking the paradigm and getting in sync with Moore's law. Because for Black Sky, the model was build and launch a satellite, generate revenue for 3 years, and then replace it. And you wanted to do that because you could put in naturally better cameras and radios and processors because industry had evolved. And by using commercial components, you could radically bring the price down. And so it became about, could you build the satellites, launch the satellites, and operate the satellites, and then replace it every 3 to 4 years in a manner so that you always had the latest tech and you were always driving down costs. And so that's fundamentally what the small satellite revolution is about. That's why Starlink worked and teledesic didn't, is because they were industrializing the manufacturing processes of the satellites. And what Elon Musk has done that no other space company has done is focus on the industrial revolution, taking Tesla to 2 million cars production, generating tens of thousands of satellites. And ultimately, he's doing that with Starship. Whereas not only is it going to be highly reusable, it's highly manufacturable. He is building airplanes like Boeing builds airplanes, where you're talking about, I think the production rate of the 737 and of the Airbus equivalent is in the 40 to 50 units per month. And you hear Elon talking about thousands of Starships. So that's how he's thinking about it. He's talking about building Starships per month. And ultimately he will build tens of thousands of satellites per month. And as a result, the cost will get down to something that probably closes. Now, I'm not going to argue the science and everything else. I believe that, it will work at the right price point. I mean, everything on this hour has been about it will work at the right price point. And that's what's different about Starlink versus anything else. And that's why no one is going to catch SpaceX in any of these verticals, and why I think he could make orbital data centers work. But if you're just a company that's building satellites and you don't own the launch, I think it gets a lot harder, because if you start paying market rates, which is 3 to 10 times what SpaceX can launch it for at cost, I think you're at a competitive disadvantage, and SpaceX or someone like SpaceX will always undercut you.
do they own the market in the development market is basically what you're saying, and competition would be tough to be competitive.
I do. I think the third gen Starlink satellites, which are going to fly on Gen 3 of Starship, are 30 kilowatt satellites. They're huge. And at 30 kilowatts, you can put quite a bit of AI processing on there. So he already has the industrial infrastructure, and he's just going to scale it up. He's just going to take it to the next level and continue to drive the price down.
You have not talked about, well, I mean, effectively you've talked about SpaceX and Starship, but not talked about the New Glenn. So, but it looks to me like New Glenn cannot follow the same sort of a path that you are talking about. Or do you think I'm wrong about that?
I think
In terms of manufacturing capability to this extent and making it cheap. I mean, obviously, New Glenn is going to work on sending people to the moon and maybe cargo to the moon, etc. But that's not what we are talking about here. We are talking about something 100 times more frequent.
we are. SpaceX is one generation ahead of everybody else. Other than SpaceX, no one really has a reusable first stage that, as we've already talked about, has flown 30 some times. And so SpaceX is one generation of rocket technology ahead, but that doesn't mean there aren't people working to catch up. And so SpaceX is moving from partially reusable to fully reusable. Everyone else is going from fully expendable to partially reusable, whether it's Neutron or Stoke or Relativity or Blue Origin. And New Glenn is a fantastic vehicle, and we just need to see that the industry, need to see it fly 20 times a year instead of 2 times a year. And when they can get to that cadence, and there's demand to do that with Kuiper and other missions, I think that's great for the industry because it means there's more access to space, more launch capacity, and there's competition for SpaceX. I was at last week. I was also at the satellite conference, and the biggest complaint from the satellite operators was access to space is still constrained. If it's not SpaceX, there's very few options. And so we as the industry need Vulcan and every vehicle out there to fly. I think the other one that the West tends to forget is China, is that China has dozens of launch companies and billions of dollars pouring in to emulate SpaceX and try to catch up. And they are testing partially reusable architectures, and they're also starting to test fully reusable architectures. And they're going to copy first, and then they're going to innovate on top of that. That's what they've proven that they're very good at.
Yeah, Land Space, for example, is one of those 3 companies that I can think of.
Yep.
Is it legal for an American country to use Chinese launch service?
I don't think it's currently legal for no, the short answer is no.
Oh, okay.
But that doesn't mean European countries can't use Chinese services and vice versa. I mean, who knows what the geopolitics look like 2 to 3 years down the road, but let's suspend that for a minute. and what we need is just general competition. So that's what we need.
American competition, I'm guessing you're saying, or European, but not Chinese. So an example here is I'm thinking, as we use the Russians regularly to deliver astronauts, prior to Elon doing it, was it legal? Is it legal for us to use Russian for commercial payloads?
I think right now, U.S. foreign policy is U.S. companies will not launch their satellites on Russian or Chinese vehicles.
Okay.
I think that is
Right.
not allowed.
Right.
At the same time, we've launched U.S. astronauts on Russian vehicles.
Right.
And is there a future where commercial spaceflight participants fly on Chinese space transportation infrastructure? I think the answer is probably. We don't know how the future is going to evolve.
No, but the movies are all showing the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans all getting along, but not the governments, the astronauts themselves. You know what I'm talking about. Some
Yes.
Yeah, right. And I just love that idea. I think that's a wonderful idea. Now, there are probably people in this room who are going to blow steam out their ears because I said that, but maybe, that's just how I feel about it. I love that notion, you know, of, I
I
guess,
yeah, I think the real question is, or I got asked recently today in another forum, was, NASA's announced some very bold initiatives to get humans back to the moon in a permanent fashion, and we know China's trying to do the same thing. So we are definitely moving towards a future that is maybe motivated politically, but I also think is motivated economically to put humans into space in a permanent fashion and expand beyond low Earth orbit. And I think that's very exciting, and it's going to drive a lot of innovation. Um, there's potentially a lot of money behind it, and there's a foreign policy behind it. So where we are in, call it 5 years, is going to be really interesting.
I'd like to answer Sherry's statement, and that is, well, I worked at Texas Instruments helping design microprocessors. About 10% of the microprocessor design staff was Chinese. We also had two guys from Pakistan, one from was a Tamil from South India, and one guy was from Bangladesh. And there was 3 or 4 French guys, and we had one British guy, but he was kind of a manager, not much of a programmer. But yeah, in the United States, if you're smart, you can get a job and not a problem. On the other hand, if you try putting the Chinese Communist Party into the middle of Elon Musk's SpaceX, boy, there would be a huge conflict very fast.
right. Yeah, there would be.
Well, but he works with them in China with Tesla and other stuff. So it's a complex system.
I heard something on the news or read it. It's one of those ridiculous stockbroker come on guys, but he said, but the message, I didn't click it open, was that Elon has the gigantic project going on and spies are sending drones around SpaceX in Texas. Does anybody know what that's about?
Yes, there are drones going around Boca Chica all the time. And you can see many of the film clips by going and listening to Marcus House Space. I usually watch it on Saturday mornings. And, they show the little camera drones flying around and taking pictures and talking about the infrastructure and what they're doing, which crane is lifting what, et cetera, et cetera. It's all wide open. In fact, there's a public highway that goes down to the middle. So, that's once again very common right now.
We're coming up on our hour that we talked with Jason about. Does anybody have a concluding question or comment for our guest? Nobody? Do you, in terms of who you're seeing show an interest in Orbite, can you tell a difference in age grouping or gender grouping or nationality grouping? Are you getting enough input to where you could say the French are really interested, but the Germans aren't, or something like that?
I think everybody's interested. What we say, and we validate this through our client interactions, is that everyone, when you're 4 years old, dreams of being an astronaut, as well as unicorns and dinosaurs. And when they're 40 years old, they still dream of being an astronaut. We don't talk about the other two things. And that's exactly what we see, is like we get people come to us and say, oh my gosh, I've been looking for a way to experience space from the inside and to start this journey and to get educated on what I can do and learn more about the industry. So we've seen it from all age groups, all demographics, all geographies. I think there's a lot of excitement and pent up demand, and we're excited to fulfill that.
In scuba diving, we had an age limit before they would train someone. Do you foresee an age limit for spaceflight training or going into space?
Well, I actually just met the youngest person to go to space, Oliver, who was 18 when he flew with Jeff Bezos on the first Blue Origin flight. I think that's probably a good age limit to start from, just from a legality standpoint, because space is inherently dangerous. You know, despite perceptions, it's still somewhat risky. So I think 18 is a good place to start. We allow people to train earlier than that, but you have to be accompanied by your parent or an adult.
So one more question, because surprisingly, over the years, a lot of people have said they would love to go to space, but they want to take their pet with them. So have you come across this interest about space flight and people want to taking their pet with them on space flight? And how could that be arranged?
You know what, David, we have a sales and marketing meeting tomorrow. I'm gonna ask our sales team if we've got that question. Otherwise, I will bring it up as you the first person to ask to make that request. I've not heard that before.
No, people say they would go to Mars if they could take their pet or their moon. Um, so
I don't think that's going to be a first generation thing because I don't know how to train that pet to go to space, and I think it would be very uncomfortable for them, but we'll figure it out.
uh, any closing comments or anything from you? I did notice on your website you had a membership organization or something like that.
We do. We for our initial guests, we have what we call the Founders Club, which is allows them to come and be lifetime memberships of Orbit. We're building, as you can imagine, you just don't get off your couch and go to space or train for space. So we're building, while we're operating programs today in select geographies around the world, both in North America and in Europe, as well as in the Middle East and the Caribbean and the Antarctic. We're building dedicated facilities, with the first one being at Cape Canaveral. So there's a lot to unveil, and yes, we do have a club for our clients, and we have a series of events over the course of the year. So there is a space lifestyle of people who are like-minded individuals. We call them maverick adventurers, early adopters, who are excited to go to space, and fits the profile of some of the people you've already seen fly on Blue Origin and SpaceX and others.
Terrific. Jason, thanks for coming back on, and we'll be following it, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again down the road, and appreciate your coming back on the show.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. It was an engaging conversation, and would love to come back.
Nice to see you, Jason, again.
It is. You take care.
Goodbye,
Take
everyone.
care, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.